The galaxy had been at war for centuries, and the once mighty empire of the Zahara people was now on the brink of collapse. Destroyed by years of conflict and betrayal, the empire's people had lost all hope. Their land, once teeming with life and grand cities, was now a shadow of its former self. It was said that the Zahara had once ruled the stars with unmatched strength, but now they were fractured and weak. In the capital, a towering palace, half ruined from the years of battles and fire, stood like a testament to the empire's lost glory. Inside, Princess Zyra, the last living heir to the throne, prepared for a journey that could either save her people or destroy them all. She had no choice. She had to find help. The rebellion that had risen up against her family was too strong. Her father, the last emperor, had fallen in battle, and now it was up to Zyra to restore peace, if it was still possible. Zyra was not just a princess. She was a fierce warrior. She had been trained in combat from a young age and had learned the ways of her people's ancient traditions. Her father had taught her that leadership was not about ruling from a throne, but about protecting your people, even if it meant going into battle yourself. Her reputation as a warrior was well known, and she had fought beside her father in many battles. But now, she was alone. She stood in front of a large old mirror, looking at her reflection. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and her eyes, though filled with sorrow, still shone with determination. She wore the armor of her ancestors, a symbol of her royal blood. But this was not a time for pride. It was a time for action. The rebellion was closing in on the capital, and if she didn't act fast, the empire would fall into complete ruin. Zyra clenched her fists. She had heard rumors of an unlikely ally, humans. The Zahara had never trusted humans, believing them to be weak and unworthy of any alliance. But things were different now. Desperate times called for desperate measures. And the human who had recently made a name for himself, Captain Kale, was someone she had to meet. Captain Kale was a warrior known across the galaxy for his cunning and bravery. He had led his crew through countless battles and was said to have an unbreakable will. He had even faced enemies who were considered unbeatable, and yet he had always come out victorious. His reputation had reached Zyra's ears, and she knew that he was the only one who could help her. It wasn't just Kyle's reputation that made Zyra seek him out. It was also the stories she had heard about him, stories that said he had a heart of gold, something that was rare in the galaxy. Maybe it was that heart, or maybe it was just sheer desperation, but Zyra knew she had to find him. The palace's council had advised against it. They had warned her not to trust the humans, but Zyra knew she had no choice. The rebellion was stronger than her empire, and her people needed help. She could not let the Zahara become a memory. The future of her people depended on what she did next. With a final glance at her reflection, Zyra turned and walked out of the room. The long halls of the palace echoed with her footsteps as she made her way to the royal ship. She would travel to the human colonies herself if she had to. She had no time to waste. Outside the palace, the sky was overcast and the wind howled through the streets. Soldiers stood at attention, their faces hard and weary from years of battle. The rebellion was no longer just a threat. It was a reality. Zyra's heart ached for her people, but she knew that the only way to save them was to find a way to unite them. And for that, she needed Kale. She boarded the royal ship, a sleek silver vessel that had been built long ago for diplomatic missions. The crew, loyal but exhausted, prepared for takeoff. Zyra had never felt more alone. The weight of her father's crown felt heavy on her head, and the future of her people seemed uncertain. But she pushed those feelings aside. She had a mission. As the ship lifted into the sky, Zyra looked out the window at the ruins of the capital. The once grand city was now filled with smoke and dust. It was a shadow of what it had been. If she didn't succeed, the rest of the galaxy would soon forget the Zahara. They would be nothing more than a memory, a lost civilization that had failed to adapt. Zira closed her eyes and took a deep breath. There was no going back now. She had to save her people. She had to save the Empire. And if Kale could help her, she would do whatever it took to gain his trust. The ship traveled faster than light, heading for the human colonies at the edge of the galaxy. Zira sat in her private quarters, her thoughts racing. She knew that she was asking for a lot, more than she could ever repay. The stories about Kale had intrigued her, but they also made her nervous. The humans were unpredictable and she didn't know what to expect. But in a way, Zira respected that. She had been raised to believe that the strongest leaders were the ones who could take risks, and this, she knew, was the biggest risk of all. As the ship entered human space, Zira's mind wandered. She thought about the empire that was crumbling, the people who depended on her, and the promise she would have to make. She knew she would ask Kale for help. But would he agree? And if he did, what price would he ask in return? Her heart skipped, a beat as she thought of the offer she would make. An offer she had never expected to make in her lifetime. But if Kale helped her, she would do what she had to save her people, even if it meant making an unthinkable promise. The ship continued its journey, and Zira knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter for both her people and herself. The journey through space was long, and Princess Zira spent much of it lost in thought. The ship hummed quietly as it cut through the vast emptiness of space. The crew members were mostly silent, focused on their tasks, but Zira could feel the tension. Her mission was crucial, but she also knew the risks. The rebellion was stronger than ever, and it wasn't just the soldiers she had to worry about. There were spies everywhere, even in her own palace. If they knew she was gone, they would hunt her down, but there was no turning back now. Zira had to find Kale. As the days passed, the ship finally reached the edge of human space. Zira's heart quickened. This was it. She had heard many stories about humans, how they were brave but often unpredictable. Some said they were warriors, while others claimed they were nothing more than mercenaries for hire. Zira didn't know what to expect, but she hoped that Kale would be the ally she needed. She had heard whispers that he was different from other humans, strong, honorable, and capable of achieving what many believed impossible. The ship approached the human colony's docking station. Zira stood up, straightened her armor, and walked toward the docking bay. The crew followed her, but it was clear that they, too, were nervous. They had never been to human space before, and the unknown stretched out before them like a vast and dangerous ocean. But Zira's resolve was clear. She would not let fear stop her from saving her people. As the ship docked, the massive door of the bay opened, revealing a bustling human colony. The streets were alive with people, their voices blending in a chorus of different languages. Zira couldn't help but marvel at the diversity. Humans came from so many different backgrounds, and yet they had built something powerful together. This unity, she realized, was something her people could learn from. The moment Zira set foot on human soil, a group of soldiers approached, led by a man in a long black coat. He had sharp features and a hard gaze, but there was something in his eyes that made Zira feel like he was sizing her up, just as she was sizing him up. "You must be Princess Zira," the man said, his voice deep and calm. "Captain Kale is expecting you." Zira nodded, trying to remain composed. "Lead the way," she said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. She had no idea what Kyle would be like, but she had to trust that he would help her. They followed the soldier through the busy streets of the colony, passing by shops and markets filled with strange goods and loud chatter. The colony felt chaotic, but there was also a sense of order beneath it all. People seemed to work together, moving efficiently, as if they had learned how to survive in a world full of chaos. After a short walk, they arrived at a tall, imposing building at the center of the colony. It looked like a military base, its walls reinforced with heavy metal plating. 2 armed guards stood at attention in front of the doors, and they stepped aside as Zira and her party entered. Inside, the atmosphere was serious but not unfriendly. The walls were lined with various displays of weaponry, and soldiers moved about, performing their duties. Zira couldn't help but notice the discipline and focus in their eyes. These humans were soldiers, real warriors, not just mercenaries. She had heard stories, but now she was seeing it firsthand. At the center of the room stood Captain Kale, leaning against a metal table, his arms crossed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple combat suit that seemed to match the uniform of his soldiers. His eyes were a piercing blue, and his expression was hard to read. But when he saw Zira, his lips twitched into a small, knowing smile. "You're here," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "I wasn't sure you'd make it." Zira stepped forward, holding her ground. She had come for his help, and she wouldn't show weakness. "I've come to ask for your aid," she said, her voice clear. "My empire is on the brink of collapse. The rebellion is too strong, and I cannot save it alone." Kyle studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "And you want me to help you," he said slowly. "I've heard about your people, Princess. I know what they've done. But you're asking for more than just an alliance. You're asking me to risk everything." Zira's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "I am offering you a chance to save an empire. And more than that, I am offering you a partnership, one that will change the future of both our people. If you help me, I will ensure that our 2 races are united. Together, we can build something stronger than either of us could alone." Kale raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You're asking for a lot, but you're also offering something few would be willing to give. A partnership between our races, you say?" Zira nodded. "Yes. Together we can defeat the rebellion and restore the Zahara Empire. I am not asking you to fight a war for me, Captain. I am asking you to stand by my side." For a long time, Kyle didn't speak. He simply looked at her, weighing her words. Zira stood tall, unwilling to back down. She had nothing left to lose. Her people were dying, and she needed Kale's help. Finally, Kale broke the silence. "All right, Princess, I'll help you, but I want something in return." Zira frowned slightly. "What do you want?" Kale's eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "I want the promise you made. You said you would bear me strong offspring. That's a price I'm willing to pay for this alliance." Zira's heart skipped a beat. She had expected a bargain, but she had not anticipated this. Still, she understood the importance of the gesture. It was an offer she had made in desperation, but now it felt more like a binding contract than ever before. "I will keep my word," Zira said, her voice steady. "But only if you stand by me, as you have promised." Kyle nodded, his face serious. "Then it's settled." The deal was made, and Zira could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest. She had done what she had to do, but the true battle was only just beginning. She had Kale's help, but now she had to lead her people to victory. Captain Kyle's decision to help Zira was the first step in a long journey, one that neither of them had anticipated would bring them closer. The alliance they had forged was born from necessity, but as the days passed, something began to change. They weren't just fighting to save an empire anymore. They were fighting for each other and for the future of 2 different peoples. The days that followed were a blur of planning, strategizing, and gathering allies. Zira and Kale worked side by side, mapping out the rebellion's strongholds and planning their next moves. Each day brought new challenges, and the rebellion grew more determined to tear the Zahara Empire apart. But Kale's experience and cunning were unmatched, and his leadership inspired the people who had once been skeptical of the humans. Under his guidance, They began to see the humans not as mercenaries, but as equals, warriors who understood the value of survival. Zira, too, found herself changing. Her views on humans had shifted ever since she met Kyle. She had been taught to believe that humans were weak and disorganized, but Kyle was proving her wrong. He was a natural leader, and his calm demeanor in the face of danger was something that Zira admired deeply. The more they worked together, the more she began to see him not just as a tool to save her empire, but as an ally she could trust with her life. As they sat in the war room, surrounded by maps and strategic plans, Zira found herself looking at Kale in a way she hadn't before. He was speaking, explaining the next phase of their plan, but she was barely listening. Her mind was on something else entirely. Kale's presence seemed to fill the room, and she couldn't help but notice the way he carried himself, confident, capable, and resolute. There was a quiet strength in him that she had come to admire, and something deeper that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't just his physical strength, but his character, the way he held fast to his beliefs. She shook herself from her thoughts and focused on the map in front of her. "What's our next move?" she asked, her voice steady, but with a hint of urgency. Kyle looked up from the map, his eyes locking with hers. "We move on the rebel stronghold near the eastern coast. If we can take that, we'll cripple their forces and have a clear path to the capital." Zira nodded, absorbing his words. "It's risky. The rebels have fortified their position, and they've been waiting for us to make a move. They won't give up without a fight." Kyle gave her a small smile. "Then we'll give them a fight they won't forget." The confidence in his voice was reassuring. It was a plan that could work, and Zira knew that Kyle was the best person to lead them through it. He had already proven his worth time and time again, and she too had learned to trust him. In the chaos of battle, it was Kale's voice that steadied her, his commands that brought order to the confusion. The next day, they gathered their forces, preparing for the assault on the rebel stronghold. Zira's soldiers were fierce and loyal, but Kale's influence had spread through them. He had trained them in human tactics, teaching them to think quickly and adapt to any situation. The Zahara had always fought with honor, but Kyle had shown them the value of strategy, of thinking beyond strength. It was this new approach that gave them hope. As the army marched toward the eastern coast, Zira found herself walking beside Kale. She had seen him in battle, commanding his troops with precision, but now, walking side by side, it was different. There was a quiet understanding between them. They were no longer just allies by circumstance, they were partners in a shared mission. The closer they got to the rebel stronghold, the more the tension in the air seemed to grow. Zira's heart raced, not just with the fear of battle, but with the weight of what she had promised. She had made a bargain with Kale, and that bargain meant more than just saving her empire. It was a bond, one that neither of them fully understood, but one that was growing stronger with each passing day. As they approached the stronghold, Kale turned to her. "Are you ready?" Zira met his gaze, her heart pounding. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. There was no turning back now. She had chosen this path, and no matter where it led, she would walk it with him. The battle was fierce. Explosions rocked the ground as Kale's forces clashed with the rebels. Zira fought. Alongside them, her sword flashing in the sunlight, cutting through enemy lines with precision. The rebel forces were well trained, but they hadn't expected the combined might of humans and Zahara. Kyle was everywhere, his tactics guiding the soldiers, his presence a constant source of strength. Zira watched him as he moved through the battlefield, calm and focused, his every action calculated. He was a leader, and in that moment, Zira realized just how much she had come to rely on him. The battle raged on, but with Kale's guidance, the tide began to turn. Slowly, the rebels were pushed back, their defenses crumbling. Zira could see the desperation in their eyes as they realized they were losing. But it wasn't just their loss that weighed on her. It was the realization that they were fighting for a cause they didn't fully understand. The rebellion wasn't just about freedom. It was about power, and the people leading it had no interest in peace. Kale's voice rang out through the chaos, giving orders to his soldiers. Zira fought beside him, her determination fueling her strength. Together, they moved forward, unstoppable. As the battle ended and the rebel forces were forced to retreat, Zira stood among the wreckage, looking at the soldiers around her. They had won, but the cost was high. The bodies of fallen soldiers, both Zahara and human, littered the battlefield. Zira's heart ached for the lives lost, but she knew that they had fought for something greater: freedom, unity, and a future where both races could stand together. She turned to Kyle, who was standing at the front of his troops, his face covered in dirt and sweat. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, they both stood in silence, sharing the weight of the victory. "You did it," Zira said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Kyle nodded. "We did it, together." Zira realized that the alliance they had forged was more than just an agreement. It was the beginning of something much bigger. They had proven that humans and Zahara could work together, that their strength was not in their differences, but in their unity. And for the first time, in a long while, Zira allowed herself to believe that there was hope for the future. The rebellion had been dealt a heavy blow, but Princess Zira knew that the fight wasn't over yet. The stronghold they had taken was only a small piece of the puzzle. The real heart of the rebellion, the place where the leaders and the true power of the insurgents lay, remained deep within the rebel capital. And if they didn't strike soon, the momentum they had gained would slip away. The rebellion would regroup, rebuild, and come at them with even greater force. Zira stood in the war room once again, Kale beside her, as they surveyed their next move. The walls were lined with maps, each one showing a different part of the empire, each one more critical than the last. Their army was tired but determined. They had proven their strength once already, but this time would be different. This time, they would go straight to the heart of the enemy's power. "We've broken their outer defenses," Zira said, her voice steady as she pointed to the map. "But their command center is buried deep in the heart of the capital. It won't be easy to get to." Kale nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied the map. "The rebel leaders will be expecting us. They know we're coming. This will have to be a surprise attack." Zira bit her lip. She knew what Kale was suggesting: a stealth mission. They would infiltrate the capital, moving quickly and silently, striking before the rebels could prepare a counterattack. It was a risky plan, but it was their best chance. "I'll lead the charge," Zira said, her hand tightening around the hilt of her sword. "I won't let this empire fall without a fight." Kyle turned to her, his eyes flashing with a mixture of admiration and concern. "We fight together, Zira, but I'll need you to trust me on this. I'll take the lead on the strategy. You're the one who will need to lead the charge in the final moments. We need your strength when it counts." Zira took a deep breath, nodding. She had trusted Kale every step of the way, and there was no reason to stop now. She had seen how his strategy had changed the course of their battles before. But now, the stakes were higher. The future of her empire and their people depended on what they did next. The days leading up to the assault on the rebel capital were tense. Zira spent her time preparing, making sure every soldier knew their role and was ready for the mission. Ahead, Kale was a constant presence at her side, his calm leadership a stabilizing force in the midst of the chaos. He had earned the respect of her people, and they were ready to follow him into battle. As they neared the capital, Zira's nerves began to tighten. She had fought in many battles before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another fight to protect her people. This was the final stand, the one that would either save or destroy everything she had known. In the dead of night, they arrived at the outskirts of the capital. The city was dark, with only the faintest glimmer of lights shining from the windows of distant buildings. The rebel forces had set up camp on the outskirts, but they hadn't yet realized that Zira's forces were so close. Kyle motioned for the troops to stay silent, and they moved quickly through the narrow streets, their footsteps muffled by the cold night air. Every corner was a potential danger, every shadow a possible enemy. But Kyle led them through the city with precision, his strategy unfolding as he had planned. They moved like ghosts, slipping through the streets without being seen. Zira's heart raced. She had never felt such intensity. The quiet was suffocating, but it gave them the element of surprise. As they neared the heart of the rebel capital, Zira could feel the weight of her mission pressing down on her shoulders. This was it, the final test. At the center of the city stood a massive building, once a symbol of the Empire's might, now a symbol of the rebellion's strength. This was where the rebel leaders gathered, and this was where Zira's forces had to strike. If they took this building, they would cut the rebellion's head off. Without their leaders, the remaining rebels would have no purpose, no direction. It was a risk, but it was their only chance. Kyle signaled for the troops to halt as they reached the building's base. The doors were heavily guarded, and the soldiers positioned themselves in strategic positions, ready for the next move. Kyle turned to Zira, his expression serious. "Now is the moment," he said, his voice low. "We move fast. We'll take the first floor, secure the command center, and move up. You and I will lead the way. Trust me." Zira met his gaze, feeling the weight of the promise she had made to herself, to her people, and to him. She didn't hesitate. "I trust you," she said firmly. The doors to the building opened with a quiet creak as they charged in. The rebel soldiers inside were caught off guard, and within moments the battle began. Zira fought with everything she had, her blade flashing in the dim light as she cut through the enemy forces. She was faster, stronger, and more determined than ever before. Kale moved beside her, his sword a blur as he cut down enemy after enemy. His strategy had worked. There was chaos among the rebels as they tried to reorganize, but Zira and Kale's forces were too powerful, too well prepared. The rebels couldn't keep up, but the heart of the battle was still ahead. The rebel leaders were at the top of the building waiting for them. Zira's heart pounded in her chest as they fought their way up. She could feel the tension building, each step bringing them closer to their final goal. When they reached the top floor, the rebel leaders were waiting. Zira and Kyle entered the room, their eyes scanning the room for any signs of resistance. The rebel leaders were gathered around a table, their faces grim as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation. "We're here," Kale said, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is over." The rebel leaders stood, ready to fight, but Zira could see the fear in their eyes. They knew it was too late. Their rebellion had been crushed. The Zahara and the humans had united, and together they were unstoppable. Zira stepped forward, her eyes cold and unwavering. "This empire is mine to protect, and you will not take it from me." With that, the final confrontation began. The fate of the rebellion and the empire was decided in that room. Zira and Kale fought together, their strength and unity unstoppable. And as the rebel leaders fell, Zira knew that the future of her people was secure. The rebel leaders had fallen, their forces scattered, their empire in ruin. Princess Zira stood in the heart of the rebel stronghold, her sword still in her hand, its blade shining with the light of victory. The battle was over. Her people had been saved. But as the silence settled over the once thriving city, a new question lingered in the air. What now? Zira's heart was heavy, but there was a small spark of hope. The rebellion had been defeated, but it was only the beginning. The war had taken its toll on her empire, and while the soldiers celebrated, Zira couldn't help but think about what came next. The future was uncertain, and her empire needed more than just victory. It needed rebuilding. Beside her, Captain Kale stood, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed the aftermath. He had led his soldiers with unmatched skill and determination, but he too knew the work ahead would be far from easy. "It's not over yet," Kyle said, his voice low but firm. Zira turned to him, meeting his steady gaze. "I know. The real work starts now." As they made their way back to the palace, Zira couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between her and Kale. They had fought side by side, bled side by side, and in that time, something had grown between them. What started as an alliance born from necessity had evolved into something deeper, something neither of them had expected. Kale had proven himself in battle, not just as a warrior, but as a leader. He had earned the respect of her people, and now it seemed that Zira's thoughts about him were shifting too. She had trusted him with her people's future, and he had delivered. But more than that, she had come to admire him, to rely on him, in a way she never thought possible. As they entered the palace, the sounds of celebration filled the air. The soldiers, Zahara and human alike, cheered, their voices echoing through the halls. Zira allowed herself a small smile as she watched the people who had fought so hard for this moment. But it was fleeting. Her thoughts were still on the future. The war was over, but rebuilding would take years, and to do that, she would need Kale's help. The alliance between humans and Zahara could not be a temporary one. It had to be lasting. If their people were to thrive, they needed to work together, not just as allies, but as equals. Later that evening, as the stars glittered above, Zira and Kale stood alone on the balcony of the palace. The city below them was quiet now. The fires of battle finally out. The wind was cool, carrying with it the scent of the distant sea. It was a peaceful moment, a moment they both needed after the chaos of the past few days. "You were right," Zira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were right all along. We needed each other." Kyle glanced at her, his eyes softening. "I didn't expect you to agree so quickly," he said with a small smile. "But I'm glad you see it now." "I didn't understand," Zira admitted, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I thought the Zahara were strong enough to stand alone. But we were wrong. We need to build a future together. Humans, Zahara. We have to be equals, not just in battle, but in life." Kale stepped closer, his presence a steady warmth beside her. "We can do that, together. I've seen what both our people are capable of. This is just the beginning." Zira looked up at him, her heart racing. They had been through so much together, fighting side by side, surviving the worst of the war. But now, standing here with him, she realized how much more they had ahead of them. They had saved the Empire, but it was what they did next that would shape their future. "You've been a warrior, Kyle," Zira said, her voice strong. "But now you'll be something more. You'll be a leader of our people, not just the Zahara, but humans as well." Kyle's eyes widened slightly. "You're asking me to lead?" Zira nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I am. Our people will need guidance. We will need to rebuild, but we cannot do it alone. We need your wisdom, your strength. You've already shown us what we're capable of when we work together. Now, we can build something lasting." For a moment, Kale was silent. The weight of her words hung in the air. He had never asked for power, never wanted to lead an empire. But now, as he looked at Zira, he understood. This wasn't about power. This was about creating something better, something stronger for both their peoples. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'll stand beside you, Zira. Together, we'll lead." Zira's heart swelled with pride. The journey had been long and difficult, but in this moment she knew they had made the right choice. The future of her empire was in their hands, and it was a future she believed in. The days following the battle were filled with plans and decisions. Zira and Kale worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost, to heal the wounds of war and create a future that was brighter for everyone. But as the dust settled, one thing became clear. This was not just Zira's empire anymore. It was theirs. Both human and Zahara. Zira met with her council, her advisors, and Kale by her side. Together, they began the long process of establishing peace. The people of the Zahara Empire had seen the strength in the humans, and the humans had seen the resolve in the Zahara. They were no longer two separate races. They were one people, united under a common cause. As Zira stood at the head of the council, Kyle beside her, she looked out at the faces of those who had once been divided. They were all united now. And together they would build a new empire. One based on unity, on strength, and on a future that would endure. The empire was no longer just about her legacy. It was about their legacy, one that would last for generations, a testament to the power of unity and the strength of the human and Zahara spirit. The day the rebellion was finally over was the day the future began. Princess Zira stood on the balcony of the royal palace, her eyes scanning the vast city before her. The streets, once filled with dust and ruins from years of war, now seemed to hum with the energy of hope. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the city and the people below. For the first time in a long while, Zira felt peace. Her empire, once divided and fractured, was now united. Not just under the banner of the Zahara, but also under the banner of humanity. The partnership between the Zahara and humans had not only survived, but had thrived. Together, they had brought down the rebellion and secured a future that would be shared by both races. Zira had always believed in her people's strength. But now, she had seen the strength of unity. As she stood there, lost in thought, Kale approached from behind. His presence was a steady comfort. Zira turned to face him, her heart swelling with gratitude and something more. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Kyle said, his voice soft, yet filled with warmth. Zira nodded, her eyes still focused on the city below. "It is. It feels like a new beginning." Kale stepped closer, standing beside her. "It is. The hardest part is over. Now comes the work of rebuilding." Zira smiled, her gaze meeting his. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Kyle returned her smile. "We have, together." There was a moment of silence between them, a quiet understanding that had developed over the course of their shared journey. They had been through so much together, battles, loss, victories, and now they stood at the precipice of something new. Zira had never imagined that a human, especially one like Kale, would play such an important role in her people's future. But here they were, working side by side to rebuild an empire from the ground up. "I never expected any of this," Zira said quietly, her voice reflecting the weight of the past and the promise of the future. "Neither did I," Kale said, his eyes meeting hers. "But sometimes life has a way of surprising you." Zira smiled again, a true smile this time. She had come to trust Kale more than she had ever trusted anyone before. Not just as an ally, but as a friend, and maybe even something more. She wasn't sure where the future would take them, but she knew that together they could face anything. As they turned back to the palace, the sounds of the city grew louder. People were working, building, and planning for the future. The Zahara and humans had begun to share ideas, share resources, and most importantly, share hope. Zira could see the beginnings of a society that would thrive on cooperation rather then conflict. The lessons of the past were not forgotten, but they were being used to create something better. The council chambers, once filled with the bitter tensions of war, were now full of voices eager to discuss peace. Zira and Kale had worked hard to ensure that both races were equally represented. The Zahara people would no longer be the rulers of the empire alone. The humans would have a say in the future, too. "We can do this, Kyle," Zira said, her voice filled with confidence. "We can build something new, something stronger." "I know we can," Kale replied. "Together, we're unstoppable." Weeks passed, and the work of rebuilding continued. Zira and Kale spent long hours in the council chambers discussing plans for the future. They worked alongside Zahara and human leaders, forging alliances, setting goals, and laying down the foundation for a new government that would serve both races. It wasn't easy, but they were determined. The future depended on it. Zira had never thought of herself as a queen. But now, in the face of all that had happened, she was beginning to understand what it meant to lead, not just with strength, but with wisdom. She had always believed in the power of unity, and now she was putting that belief into action. The empire wasn't just about her legacy, it was about the future of all her people. Kyle stood beside her every step of the way. He was not just a soldier anymore. He was a leader in his own right. His experience and strategic mind had been invaluable, but his heart, his compassion for the people, was what truly made him a great leader. Zira knew she had made the right choice in trusting him. Together, they were shaping the future of an empire, and it was a future that would be shared by both the Zahara and humans. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Zira and Kale stood together once again, this time in a quiet garden outside the palace. The stars twinkled above, and the air was cool and calm. They had both worked hard to reach this point, but there was still so much to do. The road ahead was long, but it was no longer a road filled with doubt and fear. It was a road filled with possibility. "I'm glad we're here," Zira said, her voice soft as she looked up at the stars. Kale nodded. "So am I." There was a peaceful silence between them, one that spoke more than words ever could. Zira turned to Kale, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what the future could hold for them, not just as allies, but as something more. She had made a promise to him, one that she would keep, but she had come to realize that their bond was not just about duty. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. "We've come a long way, Kyle," Zira said, her voice steady, "and I know there's still more to do. But I want you to know, I couldn't have done it without you." Kyle smiled, his eyes warm and sincere. "And you'll never have to do it alone. We'll do this together." Zira nodded, her heart full of hope. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were no longer two separate peoples. They were united, stronger than ever. Together, they would build a future where both humans and Zahara could thrive. And as the stars above glittered, Zira knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one.